Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for coming today. I'm Mark James, and I'm an assistant professor of applied linguistics at Arizona State University, where it's a lot warmer than it is here today. Today I'm going to talk for 20 minutes about the most recent published study that I've carried out on learning transfer in second language writing education. And we'll have some time then for questions. I don't have a handout, but I'm going to post my PowerPoint slides and an audio recording of the presentation on my website. So feel free to visit and download that if you like. Here's the address. I'll put it up again at the end of the presentation if you want to jot that down. This study is part of a line of research that I've been doing on learning transfer. And the context of most of this research has been English for academic purposes, or EAP, writing instruction. This study looks at one particular kind of EAP writing instruction, that which is discipline general. Discipline specificity is a key dimension along which EAP instruction varies, with discipline-specific EAP instruction targeting learning outcomes associated with a particular discipline. This includes outcomes like understanding the discourse and sentence-level characteristics of, for example, a lab report in chemistry or of a legal brief in law. On the other hand, discipline general EAP, or EGAP, that's what I'll refer to it as, targets learning outcomes believed to be applicable across disciplines. And this includes outcomes like using a writing process and using resources. I focused this study on EGAP writing instruction because this model is common in North American universities, where the students in an EAP writing course often come from various disciplines. Now, looking at EGAP writing instruction from the perspective of learning transfer raises an important question. Learning transfer is the fundamental goal of any form of EAP writing instruction, because without transfer of what's learned in a classroom to situations beyond that classroom, instruction has limited value. With EGAP writing instruction, there's an expectation that learning will transfer across a range of tasks in a variety of disciplines. But over a century's worth of research in experimental and educational psychology and human resources development suggests that learning transfer is elusive. Also, second language writing scholars and first language writing scholars have questioned whether discipline general writing instruction can really lead to such broad transfer. And while empirical research has shed some light on this issue, the results have been mixed and gaps are apparent. In particular, the extent to which learning transfers from EGAP writing instruction is unclear. So with that conceptual framework in mind, I developed a study to answer the following research questions. Does learning transfer from EGAP writing instruction to other academic courses? If so, what transfers and to where? To answer these questions, I carried out a qualitative case study in the 2007-2008 academic year, with students enrolled in one section of a 2-semester freshman EGAP writing course. Of the 19 students enrolled in that section of the course, 11 participated in the study. And this slide provides some basic background information about those students. So I gathered data throughout the year in two main ways: through interviews with students and by collecting writing samples from students' work across their courses. I interviewed each student in the middle and at the end of the fall semester, and most of the students again in the middle and at the end of the spring semester. Each interview involved a parallel set of questions which focused on whether learning in the EGAP course had any impact on writing done for graded tasks in other courses. For the writing samples, I asked students to provide copies of any writing that they did for graded tasks in their courses. Since I was interested in how broadly transfer would occur, I asked for any kind of writing, from lab reports and essays to short answers on tests and quizzes and so on. Data analysis involved two main steps. First, I examined interview transcripts for students' reports of transfer. I broke the transcripts into units of analysis, each of which dealt with a particular task in a course other than the EGAP course. Then I coded each unit for discipline, task type, and what, if any, kind of transfer had been reported. So to illustrate, here's one example unit of analysis, and this dealt with a test in a math course. So my coding looked like this. For discipline, up here, I used the university's own system of categorization for courses and programs, and this unit fell into the category natural sciences. For task type, I made some slight modifications to a system of categorization published by Horowitz in a 1986 article in the TESOL Quarterly. And with this modified system, this unit fell into the category explanation of calculation. And for kind of transfer, I used categories from a model of academic language use developed by Chappell, Grabe, and Burns in a 1997 TOEFL monograph. And this unit fell into the category establishing coherence. So that's the first step of data analysis. The second step was to examine the students' writing samples. As with the interview transcripts, I coded writing samples for discipline and task type. Unlike the interview transcripts, though, I decided to identify in advance what kind of transfer I would look for. So I generated a list of learning outcomes that were targeted explicitly in the first section of the EGAP course textbook. My reasoning was that these were expected to transfer because they were targeted explicitly, and they would have the most opportunity to transfer because they were targeted at the beginning of the book, early in the course. So through this process, I came up with the list which you can see here of 10 specific learning outcomes to look for in the writing samples. And to illustrate, here are the first two in a little more detail. The first one describing visually, and the second one stating personal significance. In column 2, we can see the operational definitions that I created. And these were meant to reflect as closely as possible the way that the learning outcome was addressed in the EGAP course textbook. For the first one, describing visually, the textbook had explained that describing people, places, or objects involved naming observable features like parts and providing details like size, number, composition, and function. So that's the basis of the definition that I created here. And you can see in the third column some examples of that learning outcome being applied in students' actual writing samples. The next row provides similar information for the second learning outcome, which was stating personal significance. And I did the same thing with the other 8 learning outcomes. And finally, after coding all the writing samples in this way, I needed to decide if and where transfer had occurred. So I looked at the relationship between a student's writing sample from the EGAP course and each of her or his writing samples from other courses. I assumed that transfer had occurred if a student had applied a given learning outcome in the writing sample from the EGAP course and had applied the same learning outcome in a writing sample from another course. To check the reliability of this entire procedure, I asked another researcher to code 20% of the data set that I had worked with. And the agreement between our coding decisions was over 90%, which I saw as acceptable. So let's take a look at the findings as they relate to the two questions, which are, did learning transfer from this EGAP writing course to other academic courses? If so, what transferred and to where? First we'll look at the data from the interview transcripts. And in terms of what, if anything, transferred, we can see here that the students reported various kinds of transfer. This is a list of 8 different categories of transfer that the students reported, and they're presented here in order of frequency based on the number of students who reported the transfer to one or more tasks. Because of time, I won't go into great detail here, but I'll show one example to illustrate how the students reported this transfer. And this example will be from the most common category at the top of the list, which is organizing. So in this example, this student was asked about 2 assignments in a film studies course and reported having tried on those assignments to use a general essay structure, more specifically an introduction, main point, conclusion structure that this student had been learning to use in the EGAP course. As for where reported learning transfer occurred, this table shows the patterns that emerged across students. The rows here are the task types, like summaries of readings and reports of experiences. And the columns are disciplines, like business and graphic design. The blank cells just mean that I didn't have any data for that type of task in that discipline. So for example, looking down the column under business, over there, that's on the left side there, there are 3 blank cells. That means that none of the business course tasks that I discussed in interviews were those task types, which are reports of experiences, syntheses of sources, or research proposals. None of my data fit into that category. But all of the other cells that have something written in them, that indicates that I did have data for that task type in that discipline. The pairs of numbers indicate how much transfer, if any, was reported. And where transfer did occur, the letters in parentheses indicate what kind of transfer that was. So, looking again at the column under business, the first row has a 0 followed by a 1. The 1 means that in the entire set of interview data, there was only one task that fell into this category, which is a summary of readings in a business course. The 0 before it means that the student who reported having done that task said there was no transfer. So it's 0 reports of transfer for the one task in that category. 2 rows down, there is a 1 followed by a 1. That means that in this category, which is connection of theory and data in a business course, there was one task, and the student who did this task did report transfer. And the letters in parentheses, O and R, indicate that this transfer fell into 2 categories, O for organizing, R for using resources. And one more row down, we can see that there were 2 tasks for case study, 2 tasks, and transfer was reported for one of these tasks. The letter P indicates that this transfer involved using a writing process. So, there's a lot of detail here, but stepping back from this table, the main thing to note is that transfer was reported to at least some degree across all 6 disciplines and all 7 task types. As for the writing sample data, and the question of what, if anything, transferred, this table shows the relevant findings. In the first column, you can see the number of each student, 1 through 11. But note that students 2 and 7 were excluded from this part of the analysis because they didn't submit any writing samples from courses other than the EGAP course. In column 2, you can see the total number of writing samples that I gathered from courses other than the EGAP course. Then there are 10 columns, 1 for each of the learning outcomes that was targeted explicitly in the EGAP course textbook. And those are the ones that I chose to search for in the writing samples. So the VIS at the top of column 3, that means describing visually. And the SIG at the top of the next column, means stating personal significance, and so on. What these numbers show then is how frequently transfer of each of these 10 targeted learning outcomes occurred for each of the students. For example, in the first row, we can see that student 1 submitted 6 writing samples from courses other than the EGAP course. And analysis showed that in 2 of these, the student did describe visually, and in 1 of them, the student did state personal significance, and didn't narrate in any of them, and didn't use similes or metaphors in any of them, and so on. Now, without going into, there's a lot of detail again here, without going into that, we can look at the totals in the bottom row and see that the targeted learning outcomes did all transfer to at least some degree, though some of them more than others. We'll take a quick look at 2 more tables, and then I'll summarize. This table shows where transfer occurred in the writing samples according to discipline. In the first column, there are 6 disciplines, along with the students from whom writing samples were gathered in that discipline. In the second column is the number of writing samples that were gathered. In column 3 is the number of transfer opportunities in those writing samples. And I'll explain briefly what that means. If a student had demonstrated all 10 targeted learning outcomes on the writing sample I gathered from the EGAP course, I assumed that for each of the other writing samples for that student from other courses, there were 10 opportunities for transfer, 1 for each of the targeted learning outcomes. In the same way, if a student had demonstrated only 9 of the targeted learning outcomes on the writing sample that I gathered from the EGAP course, I assumed that for each of the other writing samples for that student from other courses, there were 9 opportunities for transfer, 1 for each of the targeted learning outcomes the student had previously demonstrated. So most of the students had demonstrated all 10 of those targeted learning outcomes on the writing sample from the EGAP course, but a few demonstrated only 9 or 8. So that's where the numbers in this third column come from. And in the final column, we can see how many instances of transfer were actually observed in the writing samples, both as a raw number and as a percentage of those opportunities. So let's look at the first row just to clarify. In the discipline of business, the first one, there were 2 students, student number 1 and student number 10, who submitted writing samples for me to analyze. The total number of writing samples was 3. So obviously 1 from one student, 2 from the other. With those 3 writing samples, the total number of opportunities for transfer was 29. And that means that if both of these students had demonstrated all 10 targeted learning outcomes on the writing sample from the EGAP course, this number would have been 30. But it's 29 because one of those students demonstrated only 9 of the 10 targeted learning outcomes on the writing sample from the EGAP course. And in the last column, we can see that across those 3 writing samples, a total of 8 instances of transfer were observed. And that represents 28% of the opportunities for transfer. So what's most important here, looking down the final column, is that although there was variation across disciplines, transfer did occur across all 6 disciplines. And one last table. This table presents exactly the same data, but this time it's organized according to task type rather than discipline. So we can see in the first column, over there, the 7 categories of task types: summary, report, connection, and so forth. And the other 3 columns are the same kinds of information as in the previous table. And what we see here, again looking down the final column, is that although there was variation, transfer occurred across all 7 task types. So that's it for the specific findings as they related to the research questions. And to summarize, the data here indicate that learning did transfer from this EGAP writing course to other academic courses. That's important because transfer is a desirable result of any kind of EAP instruction. This transfer involved a variety of learning outcomes, and this finding helps add detail to our picture of transfer in EAP education. Also, the transfer documented in this study occurred across a broad range of task types and disciplines. That too is important, because in discussions of discipline specificity in EAP instruction, there has been doubt expressed that learning outcomes from EGAP instruction can transfer broadly. The findings in this study suggest that broad transfer is in fact possible. But these findings don't necessarily mean this EGAP writing instruction was, from a transfer perspective, successful. Even though transfer occurred, this transfer was inconsistent. With the majority of tasks, transfer was not reported. And in many writing samples from those tasks, little transfer was observed. EAP instructors, understandably, might see this kind of pattern as problematic. With that in mind, it's worth conducting further research on this topic. Knowing that learning can transfer in an EGAP writing instructional setting, it's worth searching for the factors that at times inhibit this transfer. If these factors include some that teachers or curriculum developers have any control over, it might be possible to teach EGAP writing in a way that leads to more consistent learning transfer. And that's a practical result that would be of real value in most, if not all, EAP settings. So the findings in this study have shed some helpful light here, but there is a lot more that can be done to build our understanding of this important topic. And the last slide I'll leave up during our question and answer session. These are the references, and this again is my site where you'll be able to download these slides and recording afterwards if you like. Thank you. I think we have 10 minutes?
Yeah, we have about
8 minutes for questions?
Yeah, 8, 9.
Okay. Please.
A question and a query. The concern I have is the causality. I don't know if you can claim that there's a transfer from that particular subject, although we'd love to
Mm-hmm.
that to the other subject because they may have picked it up elsewhere and because it's stated on the course.
Yeah.
And the other question I had more of a query. I can't work out how you got the percentages on one of the slides that you had to transfer because I don't know how you got those percentages without people.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go back and show you that in a second. That's the question of, whether we can claim that this is transfer specifically from the EGAP course. That's a tricky one. And, transfer is complex. It's like learning, right? It's complex, and in the end, I think, I've done a few studies on this topic, and I think that to push forward, we probably need to keep looking at it from different angles. I've done a couple of studies that were much more controlled than this. So having students in a course like this EAP course, have them do one writing task, a research task, and analyze that for transfer. This study, which was much more open and looking at the writing that students did over an academic year, the writing they did in their courses, was meant to complement that more controlled research. I think that because transfer is complex, we're going to have to keep looking at it from different angles to try to get a more precise picture of what's happening. But absolutely, that's a concern. The percentages. Something like this?
Yes. How did you get 85 out of 151 is not 56%, so I don't quite know.
Is that not 56%?
No, none of them actually are correct. None of the percentages seem to. 40 out of 77 is not 52% either.
Uh-huh. I'll have to go back and double check. That's what it's supposed to be, so it's possible there's a little typo when I was putting this together. But oh, that's right. Yeah.
It would be 50%, but this is 40 out of 60.
Yes.
That's right. So that's right. It's a little bit.
It's 3 less.
Yeah, it's less. So it's a bigger proportion of 77 than it is of 80. Yeah. Thank you, Lou. I'll go back and double check, but yeah.
6 out of 19, 30%.
That's the idea, though. And this was a little complicated, trying to think about how to come up with some idea of the relative frequency of transfer. And the best that I could do was to think of it as a proportion of these opportunities for transfer. I think there are other ways of doing it. This as I mentioned, was published recently, this research study. And the reviewers had raised questions about how this was done. we discussed a couple of different ways of coming up with some picture of the frequency. This was the best that I could do for now. But another way was to look at, for example, just how many students reported, how many students demonstrated transfer, or in how many writing samples did transfer occur. But there were drawbacks to each way of doing things. So again, I think it's complicated, and it's going to require multiple studies to really come up with a really firm, clear picture of what's happening here. Other questions? Please.
Could you go back to the slide where it lists not task type but kinds of transfer recorded?
This one?
No. It was early on, and you were going to focus on the first, that one.
Yeah. So now this is coming from the interview transcripts. So when I interviewed the students, I asked them, did anything that you've been learning, practicing in the EGAP course help you in any way when you did your writing in other courses? And I let them just talk about anything that they might have thought of. And these are the categories that emerged.
Was there overlap between category 5 and 7? As we spoke to
5 and 7. It's always challenging to tease these things apart because it's an inductive analysis, right? So it's looking at things that they say and just trying to come up with some clarity. I don't think that was so difficult. I was dealing with a relatively small data set. I've done similar research with much larger data sets, and it becomes more complicated. But this one, it was 11 students, 2 or 4 interviews each. There wasn't a heck of a lot. And when they talked about this, so 3 students talking about 4 tasks, they typically talked about, they used words like grammar, right? So yeah, I think the grammar that I've been learning in that course is helping me here. And did they say? There weren't many different ways that they talked about this. Grammar, my sentence structure that I've been improving in the EAP course is helping me. It was just 2 or 3 different ways. Writing efficiently, this was just a couple of students, and they both talked about the speed of their work improving. In some way or other, they talked about speed. So, as a result of the EAP course, now I can write faster. Something like that.
Saying more and less.
Maybe it's related, yeah. There probably are going to be some connections between overlap between a lot of these, but I was taking him at face value when I was coding these things and trying to do it that way. Yeah, please.
Did you look to see whether there was good correlation between what the students reported and what they actually did in their writing?
Yeah, I didn't go into that here. I do in the paper. And I didn't do it statistically. It was difficult because there's a qualitative analysis. But I did try to figure out if what they were talking about is similar to what I was seeing when I analyzed the writing samples with those 10 predetermined learning outcomes. And there is some overlap, but there are some differences. And for example, what I did was for the purpose of trying to compare these two, the interview transcripts and the writing samples in that way, I collapsed these into categories, into 3 categories: organization, content, and language use. And I did the same thing with those 10 learning outcomes from the textbook. I put them into the same 3 categories. That way I was able to see, is one of them occurring more frequently in the different data sets. Organization as a general category, which here includes, organizing, establishing coherence. I think those were the 2. That features strongly in the interview transcript data. It also features strongly in the writing sample data. But there were some discrepancies. One of the other categories, I think it was language use, seemed to be stronger with the writing sample data than it was in the interview transcript data. So yeah, some similarities, some differences. Again, something to look more closely at with future research. Please, yeah.
Can you think of any explanation of why certain skills transfer easier than others?
Yeah. there's a huge literature on learning transfer in psychology and human resources development, and it's building a little bit in our area as well. And some of that literature has looked closely at factors that influence transfer. I didn't look closely in this paper, but that's something we definitely want to look more closely at. And for example, one of the big factors that has something to do with transfer is the similarity between tasks. So if the tasks through which we learn a skill are very similar to the tasks which we encounter outside the classroom or outside the learning setting, there's more chance of transfer happening. That's one way. Another way has to do with like metacognitive reflection. So if we think when we're learning, if we reflect in certain ways on the things that we're learning, concepts, things like that, they stand a better chance of transferring to other situations. Those are two of the major factors that are written about. But there's a lot more detail in that body of literature. It's very interesting. It's a huge body of literature. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Sure.
Did you turn on?
Absolutely.